and we can go for it. So now we are recording. Nisha, it's very nice to talk to you. We've
Hi,
known each
Gavin.
other. Hi.
Thank you for having me.
That's a real pleasure. It's really nice to spend some time with you in this way. We've known each other for a long time on and off, but we've never actually, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we haven't actually met, or unless we met once many years ago. You've got a better memory than I have.
I think we met kind of in passing a couple of times when I used to come up to Adidam events in London.
Okay.
But this is like, I'm talking 1992 or something like that.
Yes.
A long time ago, yes.
Yes.
And we may have met at the ashram in Norwich, I think. Maybe
I wish my memory was better than it was, but I'm very glad you can remember those things. So I'm very happy to be talking to you today about your book, The Unity of Everything, which is a fascinating read. And we've obviously both got a deep interest in spirituality, and that's why we know each other and why we're having this call. So I thought, just to start with, maybe you could just say, I think, a little bit about what moved you to write the book, and maybe a little bit about your spiritual journey.
Sure, thank you. Yes. Well, I became interested in spirituality when I was a student, a university student. I did a maths degree at Warwick. And while I was there, I discovered the writings of Krishnamurti, who was the first sort of spiritual teacher I discovered. And also the writings of a chap called Fritjof Capra, who wrote a book called The Tao of Physics. And that got me interested in the mystical traditions. And I started studying these quite obsessively. And when I was in my early 20s, I was back home working by then. I started to wonder, what is it that these traditions might have in common? Is there a really basic underlying core teaching that all of them share? And this led to the creation of the model that I talk about in my book, The Unity of Everything, where essentially I've just got these 8 components that I found are there in some form or another in every mystical tradition, and also in a number of teachers I was studying at the time as well, like Krishnamurti and Ramana Maharshi, or Aurobindo Adidar. And that's what led me to formulate the model. And alongside that, I was also doing a lot of spiritual practice, which was mainly Buddhist. I was studying at the London Buddhist Centre, studying meditation at the Buddhist Centre in London. And I'd also studied with a Taoist teacher when I was a student at Warwick. And the Buddhist and Taoist practices to some degree have continued pretty much to this day as well.
That's wonderful. I mean, you've got an intriguing life story of spiritual search and awakening and opening and consideration. It's quite, I'd love to read more about that at some point, if you could get that into book form at some point. So yeah, I'm sure that's a fascinating read. So thank you for that. I mean, I was just talking to you before this call about, it was so interesting to watch Krishnamurti speak with David Bohm and other scientists, Rupert Sheldrake in one video, and just and also before that in the 80s, I believe. And he was so direct in his energy and his consideration. And I just really, just affected me, the power of his mind or awareness to cut through what's not important or real to get to the essence of what's going on. And I just wanted to read something from your book. Reality emerges out of a primordial non-dual ground. And it's interesting how you use the word ground. And then you talk about, and this is the process, what you call the process of descent, as opposed to the process of ascent, which I found an interesting part of your model. So the reality emerges out of a primordial non-dual ground, and wholeness is split into 2 by action of human awareness, creating dualism between the observer and the observed. And then that leads to, as you say, to multiplicity, and then fragmentation, which leads to conflict and violence. So I thought that was a very interesting model of existence, if you like. And so that's the process of descent, which is an interesting phrase. And then the process of ascent is awareness of how we create. First of all, fragmentation is healed, I think you say. And then there's the awareness of how we create the sense of self. going on to the healing of the self and other dualism in unity, and then going beyond unity in the, and it just, as I'm reading this, it makes me want to look at what you've read in your book in more detail relative to the other traditions. And that, as you say, that common schema, if you like. So, and I'm interested in the word ground that you use there. I don't know if you want to say any more about that or about that model.
Yeah, thank you. By ground, really, what I mean is what many of the traditions refer to as non-duality. So it's the ultimate unity of everything.
Yes.
Which is the true nature of reality. How things really are is not two. There are really no differences at all. There's just this non-dual ground out of which all differences and distinctions emerge. So that's the way that I'm using the word ground. It's the ultimate reality. It's how things really are. And somehow we lose sight of that through this process of descent, because we break things up. We break things up into a whole versus a part, into a subject versus an object. And through that process of descent, we create this world where everything seems to be different from each other. And that world of difference, when those differences are taken too far, which they are in human consciousness, certainly, that's what leads to conflict and ignorance, which is at the root of all the problems in the world. So in a way, the spiritual process can be seen as a deliberate or conscious way of reversing this process, a way of healing these perception of differences.
Yes.
Until we realize that there is a whole underneath it. That wholeness is the true nature of reality, and that who we really are, our true identity, is actually that non-dual ground. That's our true identity. So to summarize, I think all the traditions tell this story, if you like, of how we move away from the ground and move back to the ground.
It's interesting, very interesting. And yeah, I had a question here actually between what was the main thing you feel you learnt from Bohm? I forget his first, I don't know his first name. Yeah, just in your interaction with him and maybe your study, would you say, is there one thing that you learned from him primarily?
Yes, very much so. I think he gave me the idea of fragmentation as opposed to multiplicity. So a lot of spiritual teachers or practitioners seem to think that the world of differences is a problem in itself. And whereas what Bohm suggested is that differences, when they're kept in their proper place, that's multiplicity, and multiplicity in itself is not really a problem.
Yes.
The problem is when we take those differences too far or too seriously, and we lose sight of the whole that's underneath, and that's fragmentation. So there's a distinction that he makes between parts and fragments, and a part is not necessarily a problem, but a fragment becomes a problem.
Is that to do with the issue of the observer and the observed being split, or is that not relevant?
Well, it is to do with that, yes. When the observer and the observed is split, if that split is taken too seriously, or if it's taken too far, then we enact what Adida calls the self-contraction, whereby we create this false sense of a separate self.
Yes.
And that then leads to a fragmented perception of the world.
Gosh, yeah, that's interesting. I was going to mention that Adida does mention the self-contraction as what causes, you know, the appearance of apparent separation. So yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that those two words. Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, so just moving on. Let me see here. Yeah, I mean, I found it interesting going back to the ground, and I just noted from your book about the whole is one half of a dualism. And is it David Bohm? That's his first name, I believe.
Yes, David
Yes.
Bohm.
He says the ground must include both the whole and multiplicity, because otherwise, like you said, the whole is one half of a dualism. And I think sometimes people might get confused about, if only I can get into union or wholeness, but there's always the other side. So unless
Yes.
there's true ground, then it's, the seeking for that wholeness is just utterly frustrated, I would think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. If we only realize the whole, but we don't give equal importance to the part, then actually, in a way, we're still fragmented because we're excluding an essential part of our experience, which is to live in the world of distinctions.
Yes.
So the real non-duality isn't just the whole. The real non-duality is the whole and the part together.
I can relate to that. I mean, I think part of my process or patterning has been to want to be in union and forget everything else. And it's been quite strong in me. And I've had to really, through Adidar's grace, being a student of Adidar, he's really sort of helped me and healed me to actually realize, no, life isn't about escape. It's actually about, there's an allowance and an acceptance within the context of spirituality and grace. And that's so different to what I would have done by automaticity. So I really get what you're saying. I really resonate with what you're saying there.
Yes. I would say the Eastern traditions perhaps have emphasized the whole more than the part, and maybe the Western traditions have emphasized the part more than the whole. So the ground is a way of finding a unity between what East and West both have to offer in that regard.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. Yeah, and then to go on from page 30 of your book, David Bohm says, you can see that the particular originates in the universal, and then the universal particularizes itself, which I found an interesting phrase. So that's again quite mysterious how that happens, and there's different ways to interpret that. And one way that Adidar uses is the self-contraction, and it's something we can be responsible for, but obviously it's quite a mysterious phenomenon and it can be seen in different ways, but it's just I like the way you put it there. It's kind of it's quite interesting.
Yes, I mean, we engage in the self-contraction ourselves, and that's how we create this perception of fragmentation. But there's also almost a way in which the cosmos itself is self-contracting as well.
Interesting.
In order to create this world of separate parts. So the contraction isn't just happening at the level of the individual, but there's a cosmic self-contraction happening.
I haven't kind of seen it like that. That's an interesting thing for me to ponder. Because, and I suppose one way to look at it, everything is contracting in and of itself. In some sense, I don't know if that, therefore the cosmos, the universe is a form of contraction, but it's good to take it out of the purely me local thing. Or another way to put it, I suppose, is that it's all contracting because the self with the capital S is contract. I don't know. I'm getting a bit too far ahead of myself, but
that makes sense. I mean, we could, if we think of the universe, the true nature of the universe as being conscious light, then the universe of separate things, those separate things are fractals in that conscious light. So that light is doing something to generate these fractals within itself.
And so the light is very paradoxical, because in some sense one could say the light is contracting on itself and creating the sense of separation. And that's one way to put it.
Yes.
And
it's what in Hinduism they refer to as Leela, which is the play of God. God is playing this game of creating separate parts, and we kind of participate in that game by creating separate parts ourselves. So our own self-contraction really is just a reflection of the cosmic self-contraction.
It's an interesting one. I mean, I suppose I might say there isn't even that duality of self-contraction versus cosmic. I feel self-contraction in some sense covers everything, because it's a primal action that we are doing that therefore colors everything that we see or do or understand. So it's kind of, in my sense of it, self-contraction is universal to the degree that I'm aware of it.
Right. Yes.
Mhm. And I do like what you said on page 60 of your book. 17 years after David Bohm that you had the conversation, you actually, because he said to you, you asked him, what should I do next, I believe you said, and then he said
Yes.
something like, live it, you know, actually you live what you talked about. I found that very interesting. And then you had these periods of absolute unity you describe, and dissolving of the separate self, and that went on to one degree or another for a while. So yeah, I wondered if you wanted to say something about that.
Yes, thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, I said to David Bohm as we were leaving, as I was leaving his office, what should I do next? And I was expecting him to, you know, give me some pointers as to further intellectual work.
Yes.
But he didn't seem that interested in that. He said, go and live it and actually live this model out in your life.
Wow.
So I just intensified my Buddhist practice for the next 17 years. And then in 2007, I was just sitting by a lake with my wife in Chatham in Kent, a very non-spiritual place. And suddenly the mind just went completely quiet. And there was a feeling of energies going around the body, down the front and up the back of the body. And it just became very intuitively obvious that I wasn't essentially separate from anything else around me. And that state, actually, I didn't even mention it to my wife. I wouldn't really know how to talk about it. And I was pretty much in that state quite intensely for about 6 months. I wasn't actually working at that point because of my health. So I was able to just sit on a chair in front of my house all day long in just this state of unity. And that went on for about 6 months. And then it started to fade gradually. It's still there in the background now, but it's never had that same overwhelming intensity that it had in 2007. But it's the background obviousness that's there.
Yes. Yeah, and I can relate. But yeah, it's in the picture. It's always in the picture. Once you've tasted it, you can't ever not have it inform your being or your life, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. Once you've seen in Hindu terminology, once you've seen that what you thought was a snake is really just a rope.
Oh yeah.
You're never fooled by snakes again. You know.
I've heard of the analogy. Yeah, I've heard of that. So yeah. Well, actually, I think, Nish, it's so nice to talk with you. I think that's about it. I think it's been really useful. And who knows, if anyone listening to this wants to hear more, has any questions for me or Nishad, please do leave a comment. And if you'd like to hear us talk more, then please mention it. So, yeah, thank you so much for this. It's been really interesting and, yeah, very interesting indeed. So,
thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And it's been great to talk. Yes.
Real pleasure. Very nice. And I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.